filtering messages. Another common router that we'll look at is when we need to determine whether a message should continue processing in a mule flow. By default, if a message is filtered successfully, it will be dropped and the processing of that message ends. It'll keep the subsequent processors from receiving irrelevant or incomprehensible messages. And filters can also be configured to throw an exception. We have multiple filters that are available to you. These filters include expression filters and payload, which are the most often used, expressions being some type of Boolean, or payload, which will check the type of the payload, and or not apply Boolean logic, so allowing us to go in and effectively say, this expression and this expression must be true, else be filtered, and so on. Message filter, which is kind of a shell that allows us to nest multiple filters together. So think of this like working in conjunction with and or. We can put a message filter in place with multiple other filters that compose it with and or logic in place. And idempotent filters that will ensure a message is not delivered more than once. So if you have a high throughput app where there's a potential of duplication, it can use an object store to effectively validate that request A did not come in 5 seconds, 10 seconds ago, and so on. You can also create your own custom filters by writing some simple Java code, and you can define global filters and reference them throughout the app so you can reuse them. In walkthrough 9.3, we're going to use a payload filter to verify the type of the message coming out of scatter-gather is appropriate. We'll also create this as a global filter so that we can define it once and then reference it in multiple locations. Let's get started. All right, we'll return to our implementation XML, and I'll do a little bit of cleanup here to make sure it's easier to see my screen. Move this over and go to design view for a moment. There we go. Okay. So inside of our implementation area, what we'd like to do is add some filters in. So at the end of each of our routes, the Delta Flights route, the American route, and so on, let's add some filters in place. But specifically, let's add them into our scatter-gather area, since this is where we want to make sure that the results coming out of scatter-gather are appropriate. So what we can do is we can select our Get All Airlines Flights flow. We can right-click on it and go to that reference flow. That way it'll drop us right down to scatter-gather. Now, if we go to the filters area of the palette, we're going to use a payload filter specifically. Now, let's just drag the payload up to the Get Delta Flights flow and use that as our first example here. We'll double click on the payload filter, and inside of the payload filter here, let's set the expected type up. Now for the expected type, we're going to use java.util.list. Now we'll go ahead and run the project, and this time we'll just run it in normal mode. All right, and actually before I go any further, I notice my flow ref looks like its name is wrong, so I'm just going to click on that and save real quick here. So just the doc name wasn't updated, nothing that should affect the functionality. So let that guy redeploy. All right, now that we're checking if it's a list, we'll go back to Postman and send the request through. And Postman should get a response back, in this case with just the United flight, which looks really good. So it's clearly able to filter that item out rather than sending it downstream to cause everything to kind of blow up when the flattening and all these other items occur. So what we'll do here is try to set ourselves up such that we can go in and make some requests to these various areas and always be able to check via this filter criteria if it is the appropriate type of payload. So let's go ahead and set that up now. To do this, we'll go back to Anypoint Studio, and inside of our global XML, we're going to go to the Global Elements tab. And again, if you didn't have Global Elements open in your tabs, you can just go to Source Main App and double-click on Global XML. We'll go to the Global Elements tab, and we'll create a new filter inside of here. Now, this will also be a payload filter that we'll be creating, so we'll hit OK. And the name of this filter will be Filter Not Array List, or list rather. And the expected type will be java.util.list. So this way we can define the filter once and we can reuse it in all of those scatter-gather routes in case something similar were to happen where, say, American didn't have a specific airline or destination rather when you actually call out to that American flow. So we'll hit OK here. We'll save up our global XML, And then we'll go back to our implementation XML. So rather than having a payload filter in each area, we're going to delete this payload filter. And in the filters area, we're going to use a filter reference in each route. So take a moment to drag a filter reference to the end of each route in the scatter gather. All right. And now we're going to set those filter references each to be set up inside of the filter not list. So we'll select these, filter not list for each one. Perfect. And now if we just run our application in normal mode, now that we're able to filter all these out, my hope is that we'll be able to make different requests that even if a certain airline is missing the destination or if all airlines are missing the destination, it'll get handled appropriately in our response. So we'll go to Postman and we'll do a request for PDF. In the case of PDF, we get our single source of United that has a flight to PDF. If we go back to something like SFO, where there are a lot of flights, we send it in, and we should see results for American, Delta, United, and so on. And then if we go back and ask for something like foo, where nothing exists, and we send that request through, we actually get a valid response back. We get an empty array representing no flights with a 200 OK. So that actually works out pretty well now that we're filtering and ensuring that a list is coming out of each of those scatter-gather paths when we're calling the flights code for foo. All right, now we're going to take a little bit of a look at a different construct called validators in the next section.